All right. Just quickly checking if all teams are here. Opening government, are you here?
Well, all the best for the round one.
All right. General rules of housekeeping. You can introduce yourself at the beginning of your speech, mention your preferred gender pronouns and how you want to take POIs. Um, Otherwise, I think all said and done, I would invite the Prime Minister to open this debate.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay, I'll take POIs in chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Non-quantitative methods in and for university admissions have substantially destroyed our capacity to both review the accuracy and the capabilities of the students, but also have made things much harder for the students themselves. So some brief setup. So obviously we would ban the use of non-quantitative methods. So we would ban interviews, we would ban essays, we'd ban like those quirky questions you see posted on YouTube that they ask the students all of a sudden to surprise them. University admissions boards are allowed to ask for normal things like mental health records, physical health records as part of a quantitative check, but not as part of any testing process to compare students against one another's. To be clear, government and opening government does not have to defend the worst version of standardized testing in status quo. We actually think that this motion does some work to improve standardized testing. This is for 3 reasons. Number 1, we have fiat because Gov gets all the resources we would have used on essays and other non-quantifiable methods, and we would instead use that on improving these essays. Secondly, is that when these are the main tests, you place, as a country, special scrutiny on the way that you do these tests, so they're much more likely to be regulated. And thirdly, of course, is that when they're standardized, you have way more data points to pull from so that you know when there's a problem and you know how to improve it and for what groups to improve it. In what ways does this improve? So in the setup, we're already doing an implicit argument. There are 3 ways in which it improves. Number 1 is that these standardized tests are much more likely to be meritocratic and reflective of skill. They're much more likely to be based on things like your logic and your abstract reasoning, as opposed to abstract facts, because there's much more scrutiny placed on them. Secondly, is that they're much more likely to involve recent research and relevant topics, and they're also trying to be more efficient because they're dealing with more and more students. Finally, of course, is that they're also likely to go through a bunch of low-hanging fruit improvements, like being able to take it repeatedly, like the GRE, instead of taking it only once, or being more accommodating for things like your disability, which they would need the resources for. So for example, audio versions of the test, or for example, versions of the test that don't require you to sit in the same room for 3 hours on end, which would be obviously quite hard for people that have difficulties doing that. So this concludes the setup already, and it shows that, in fact, the version that we're defending is much better already than status quo's version. Argument number 1. The preparation for students and universities is much worse. The framing for this argument is simple. Regardless of if the tests are more or less accurate, the institution of these tests for some universities and the institutions for these tests for some students makes preparation much more difficult, makes it much more expensive, and much more draining. There are 3 reasons why. The students themselves, 1, have to cover way more topics and styles of testing. It means that they don't just have to be masters of like mathematics and English. They also have to learn how to convey these facts in a different way. They have to be able to write creative writing essays. They have to be able to convince the person, like the interviewer, and they have to charm them into letting them into their school. So they have to cover way more topics, which means the coverage for students is much larger and much deeper. Secondly, of course, is that the qualitative methods are themselves quite vague. It's hard to know if you've gotten a perfect on an essay versus if you've gotten a perfect on a test. It's much harder to know if you successfully charmed an interviewer. So there's a race to develop your skills as hard as possible and as much as possible, because there's a race to the bottom. You don't know if you're doing better than other students, which means you have to invest way more into qualitative methods, which means not only do you have to spend more time in general, you also have to take time away from other important preparations. Finally, of course, is that they have to resort to non-academic things like the resume or like extracurriculars, which tends to be stratified along privilege and tends to be stratified along lines of class, which means that you also have to spend money outside school on extracurriculars to assess and evaluate your resume to improve it, because it's also a non-quantitative method. This has a series of impacts. The first set of impacts is on students. Obviously, the students themselves have to spend way more energy. The kids themselves have to spend more time studying for different topics, especially if they want to be guaranteed they get into a good college. Secondly, is that the students themselves spend way more resources. They have to spend on more extracurriculars. They have to spend on things that the school has to spend on in order for the pass-on costs to be efficient for the school, which means they have to spend more on interviews. They have to spend more on applications. So it's more expensive for individual students to improve their future. Finally, of course, is that it's harder for schools themselves. So schools have to spend more in every application cycle, which either means that they have less money money to admit students because they're spending $50 per student. So that cost balloons massively where they can just simply intake less students, or it means that the students themselves have to pay much more. So this impact is quite large. We fix this, of course, by one, directly improving the test itself, but also by removing the need for the things itself. So I think the question that Op might be asking is, if these tests suck so much, why do schools use them in the status quo? Why don't we just give them the option? There are three reasons why they're forced to use them and why we need to ban it. Number one is, of course, there's a race to the bottom, where schools want the best possible candidate, so they'll employ as many tests as possible, even if it might be expensive, which means that we need to correct this market failure by removing this race to the bottom, by banning it entirely. Secondly, of course, is that many of these schools do it out of tradition because they feel this is the right way, and because many of the administrations are just entrenched, so they need an outside push. But finally, of course, they do this as an excuse for nepotism, because they use this as a way to reinforce, school standards, and they use it to admit students that are nice and fail competent students through the interview using subjective means. The way for this is quite simple. Obviously, one, this is a grave harm on children. It means many children choose to kill themselves. It means many children have deeply worse lives. So maybe the gaokao is bad, but it's much worse when you have to prepare for it alongside a slew of other testing measures like essays and interviews. Secondly, of course, is that the resources are spread way too thin. So even if the tests might ideally be good, they cannot be implemented well because they are way more expensive and students cannot put their full version of their skill into it. Finally, of course, is this long-term damage to the workforce, which I'll unpack later in the second argument. I'll take a POI from CEO.
So just to clarify, your case about lots of effort also applies to tests because there's only 1,600 points you can get in the SAT. And if people have the same score, you need to take more tests, which means you need to take SAT 2, more GRE tests. This is also something you concede when you say there's more resources put into it.
So I feel like your POI would be solved if you listen to the argument, which was number one, that these tests are objective, so they're easier to prepare for. Two is that they're standardized, so there's more data points. Three is that the improvements of the test make it more meritocratic. And so less focus on studying more and more focus on the skills of the student. And four, we gave to you another point here, which is that the qualitative methods are vague, so there's a race to the bottom, which doesn't work because the tests are objective. Okay, argument two, accuracy. So these tests are also going to be more accurate than the non-quantitative methods. So in principle, first, why do we care that tests are accurate and fair? Number one is that in principle, this test dictates a lot of your life. So ideally, we would like something that dictates your college degree and what dictates your future career to be quite skill-based as opposed to totally arbitrary and luck. But secondly, of course, is that this is deeply important for a high-quality workforce and to ensure that the people that you're working with are actually also skilled. So non-qualitative methods open the way for a substantial amount of unfairness. This is for two reasons. One is, of course, on the behalf of schools themselves. They have a series of systemic incentives to fudge tests, whether it be to primarily recruit privileged students, white students, etc., to get nice alumni, and so on. This means that there's an incentive for them to fudge test results against minority students, against students that are talented but poor, which means there's a large and massive pool of talent that you never get in, which you would now have access to because of the more objective measures of the test. There's a lot that goes on in an interview that can arbitrarily affect your performance. So when these methods get wiped away, you also remove the power for the systemic biases of schools to take away some of the most talented students in university and bring them into the fold. This means that we have way better science, way better innovation. I'm sure we will impact all of that, but pretty much objectively, opening government has won this debate already.
All right, I thank that speaker for the speech. Invite Leader of Opposition.
Hi, can I confirm if I'm audible?
Yep.
Okay. POI is through voice and she, her pronouns. Yeah, okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Colleges and universities nowadays are shifting away from the typical intellectual measures, and they're shifting towards a more diverse selection process and a more diverse selection process as a whole. Right? Why is this, Chair? Firstly, this is because colleges and universities have begun to understand that intellectual measures solely isn't what ensures success. And secondly, this is another thing that they've understood within recent years is that they want a diverse student body that isn't just made up of the top 1% of the intellectual populace, right? This is largely because they understand to have a more successful student body, they cannot solely just focus on who's the smartest or who passes the most amount of exams, right? Who passes the most amount of exams, because they recognize that exams and these exams and these grades aren't what make a student succeed in life, or aren't what makes a person actually become successful, right? So why then do we think that using solely academics or using solely standardized testings so like basically goes against these steps, right? Or goes against like a more accurate representation of like having only one metric on which like a student can go into basically takes away from allowing like other students from different backgrounds to also get in, right? Why is this? Because this it becomes incredibly harder for students with like, let's say, underprivileged backgrounds to pass like this, like solely one exam, or to be able to enter a college or a university on one basis. Whereas on our side of the house, when there are non-quantitative methods, or when there are other ways that they could get into a university, it's easier for them to actually be able to be let in, right? Therefore, like on this basis, or on this basis alone, like when colleges and universities have more than one levels to their entrance, then they're more likely to have a more diverse student body, and they're more likely to be able to fulfill that want for representation and diversity, right? Understand that the goal in this debate, right, is to determine where the best way to evaluate students actually are. We tell you that on our side of the house, we evaluate students best because, firstly, we don't just focus on one aspect of them. We don't just focus on how they perform on paper, but we also focus on other non-tangible, less tangible skills such as reading, writing, comprehension, speaking capabilities, right? And sure, let's say that on our side of the house, like no student will be able to perfectly fit all of these metrics, but we think that at least on our side of the house, there are more metrics in which a student's admission could be based upon, rather than on government side where there's only one, and if you fail this one, you're gonna have to take the test again and again and again in order to actually like enter the college of your choice, right? So a couple of rebuttals before my arguments, right? Government tells us that it's on their side of the house, like standardized testing, it's more likely to be meritocratic, and that students will have to cover more than one skill on our side of the house, right? Because there are a lot of like extracurriculars that they're gonna have to focus on in order to be let in. But understand, Chair, that on our side of the house, we don't just have like non-quantitative methods, right? We can have both standardized testing and non-quantitative methods. We don't just have like one or the other, right? So this can vary from college to college or university to university, depending on their priorities. But at least on our side of the house, we have more than one metric that allows for a student to be let in, right? At the same time, understand that on their side, it is less meritocratic because, as I mentioned earlier, like passing only one exam would be unfair for a great populace of students or a great subsect of it, right? Because a lot of the time, like in order to, let's say, pass a certain to pass the SATs or something, a lot of students end up getting tutoring services for this, end up having like to get like having to pay people to help them, or having to even generally have a better educational background as a whole rather than like other students, right? Which already gives them an edge in that aspect. Whereas when we have non-quantitative methods in the mix, like sure, even if they don't do as well on this exam, then they could have like these other skills or these other talents that they don't necessarily have to pay for, or they don't necessarily have to invest as much for in order to succeed at. For example, we see like a great portion of like the world's greatest writers are literally had no like writing tutor, or didn't have to really invest in that, or didn't really have to pay for that, right? But they're still pretty good at that skill. So we think that like giving an opportunity for these students to showcase like their skill and their potential through non-quantitative methods generally equates to a more equal representation as a whole, right? Additionally, they tell us that like these exams are more accurate, or it's easier to evaluate these students like through these standardized testing protocols, right? But understand that, as I've mentioned earlier, this only represents one portion of the student, right? Like on their side of the house, they want to ban non-quantitative methods as a whole. They don't want to entertain interviews or any like essays and all that, right? Which are so important when in regards to like getting to know your student and getting to know whether or not this student is a good fit for your college, right? Or for your university, right? This is something that admissions officers and admissions offices utilize to the greatest extent, because they need to understand whether the student can fit within the standards of their colleges, not just on an intellectual capacity, but on an emotional and on a on an emotional like level as well, right? Understand that when you focus solely on the intellectual, focus solely on the tests, you don't they don't get to understand how exactly the student thinks, how this student would function within their college, and it would be so much harder to create a general student body that would satisfy the needs of these universities, right? My partner will be talking about why exactly this is harmful for the students on an individual level, right? But for all of these reasons and more, government. Thank you.
All right, I thank that speaker for the speech. I call upon DPM.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, I'll take my POIs in the chat between the 5th and 6th minute from closing. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 clashes that win OG the debate. Firstly, are these tests more accurate at measuring ability? Secondly, outside of the quality or the accuracy of the test, does this have better effects on students and society? And lastly, even if you don't believe all of this, I'll engage in the worst case about soft skills and why we still have a better outcomes for students and society in that case. Firstly, on the accuracy of measuring ability. Opening opposition tries to conflate this issue by talking about things like competition or by talking about things like costs. Let us be very clear. Firstly, they do not eliminate standardized testing, and they concede this in their speech, which means that if it's so bad that you have to go to tutoring and review center and stress about all those things, what more if you have to stress about even more things? Because surely you don't want students that are incapable to do basic arithmetic or a basic level of math and English before they get into college, but you also don't want to stress them out or put all of these costs on them. So on opposition, costs are so much worse. Secondly, when they try to talk about how this is about writing and reading comprehension ability, the reality is that standardized tests already test for many different types of intelligence, right? The SAT English section is all about testing things like reading and writing comprehension. Sure, essays also test your writing ability, but the whole problem and what's mutually exclusive, since we already co-opted writing ability, is that on opposition, you have all of the subjectiveness, you have all of the discrimination, the bias, or whatever quirky stuff that the university wants to throw in that can conflate the whole point of measuring the student's ability. In the worst case, we are going to take the trade-off about how college culture is perhaps worse, and that's the only thing we don't really measure, how well you're able to fit into the university. Why? Because we think that that's entirely a bad thing. Listen to what they want. They want colleges to pick and choose the type of students they want to let in. They want to pick and choose the kinds of people they want to afford the top quality educational opportunities, right? Which is essentially just discrimination. I think it's a better world if colleges focus so much less on things like college culture, whatever that even means, since it's so under mechanized, and focus more on the abilities of students. More on that later, and why university should be about equipping students with meaningful skills. Next thing I want to talk about is a preemption to CO and competition, right? When they talk about how you need to compete so badly, this is again still not comparative. The whole point about competition is that, okay, perhaps competition happens on either side, but as David already proved in his speech, firstly, this competition is much more meritocratic on our side. Why? Because the standardized tests are already themselves a test of objective ability. There's a lot of information about it, and they're constantly improving to be better at testing your skills, right? And therefore, even if there is competition, it's towards the right kind of things. The kind of vagueness that happens when you're trying to be the best an interviewer, when you can never really tell how what a good essay really is or what a good interview really is the problem. And that creates so much more stress on the side of the students. More on that later. But in the worst case, if we have to engage in competition, we tell you that the nature of standardized tests is that you don't have to be unique and you don't have to compete to be the best. Why? Because a test score that is high, like for example, if you get 90%, is already desirable, right? You don't have to be a 99% or to be the best, because being able to answer 90% of questions correctly to most colleges is all that matters, because you know 90% of the hard skills that you need to be a good student, right? Comparatively, it's in essays where you need to be the most essays and interviews where you need to be the most unique. You have to be the most wonder kid and to stand out, because that's the only way that an essay seems good to these kinds of interviewers. If you are that typical role of a hardworking student, which is what people really need, you are more seen to be boring, you're seen as less diverse, and you're judged on, again, these other things such as extracurricular. And that's where the costs are so much worse on that side as well, right? What are the impacts of this? Or even if you don't believe any of this about accuracy, why do we still win this debate? The first thing that is unengaged on is about stress and the mental health of students. David told you again that trying to reach these very vague goalposts and having to be such a well-rounded student that you're basically good at everything, rather than just being good at whatever you want to specialize in. And take note that, just a preemption, if they want to bring out people like art school or differently abled people, you probably can have standardized tests for art, just submit your portfolio and they grade it on, all those kinds of things. Perhaps they make you write or draw something in a certain period of time, right? The reality is, on our side, you have to stress about a lot less things. And the first benefit of this is that mental health of students is so much better. Again, it is a reality that so many people in countries where university admissions matter more end up offing themselves because of the constant uncertainty of, is my essay good enough? Can I sleep at night? In the worst case on our side, if there is some form of stress, it's a lot more productive. You can take mock gaokaos and mock SATs, see what your score is there, and say, okay, I'm fine with the score. I'll probably get this. I can just stop studying already. Or you can work towards the objective ways to improve that score at the end of the day, right? But regardless of, the worst case of offing themselves, we still think it's better that you live a more fulfilled life here. Firstly, in terms of the quality of the students, right? Because burnout is a real thing. When you have to work so hard on college admissions and it's so hard to get into college, by the time you get into college, you're probably so tired of these kinds of work and you're so tired of keeping up this facade and practicing all of these soft skills that you're probably not going to be, willing to work hard in the long run. But lastly, and most importantly, even if your youth is just marginally worse, we think that it's better for these students to spend more time on their spend more free time on what they want to do. Firstly, because youth is some of the happiest times of your life, but more importantly, because you're not burdened with responsibilities, etc. But also because it allows you to explore your passions a lot better. If you want to pursue things like soft skills and intangibles, then you should probably do that in university, and you could probably do that on your own time instead of jumping through the hoops that you have to jump through with these university admissions, because these soft skills are not productive. And this is the ultimate weighing that we want to do with soft skills, right? At the end of the day, firstly, we already told you that these soft skills are usually not productive. It's just trying to be a wonder kid, and you don't really need this in the rest of your life. But more importantly, firstly, you also can't ignore the fact that schools have more resources on government. This is debate winning on itself, because when you are able to spend a lot less on creating all of these tests or these subjective interviews, right, and you focus on just the objective tests, then you have better quality high schools that are able to prepare people for something a lot clearer. You also have better quality colleges that can let in more students and also afford more of their budgets to things like good professors, etc. At the end of the day. At the end of this debate, I've proven to you why the quality of life of students is better, why the quality of life of admissions will be better, but most importantly, why you'll actually get into good colleges, because they don't waste the resources on something so unimportant. In the worst case, about preparation, right? The cost is still so much worse than opposition, but more importantly, at least there's something you can strive towards that's clear on government. That's why we lost.
All right, thank that speaker for the speech. Invite Yellow.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
All right. start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think side government fails to note that opposition's case, as in our case, is not necessarily to say that tests are bad. It's just to say that including more metrics in your way of assessing people is one that is better for everyone as a whole. We are not telling you that exams are very bad and that they are not good at all. So we're not conceding to the fact that exam is bad. We're just trying to say that more metrics means that you have more ways of assessing individuals. Like the whole argument about trying to tell you about how you forge results for minorities and then you won't let certain people into your university. I don't see how that works, because in the current world that we live in, universities want to achieve a certain goal. They have a certain KPI to achieve in order to get to their goals. In order to maintain their status as an established university, you will still want to accept like smarter students, for example, or you still want to accept people that have the better skills. So I think a lot of their arguments that came out is not mutually exclusive, and I'm going to go through them one by one before my argument. Firstly, let's talk about this whole idea of stress and mental health. You have to tell me why it's mutually exclusive. Because number one, if you ask me, I really think that the stress and mental health of individuals is more harmful under your side of the house. Because when people are constantly having to focus on just exams and exams as a whole, and I think this also happens in status quo, when you have your parents telling you must do well in your exams, you must ace your exams, that's when it harms your mental health and stress more. When Kim told you in a speech about how you have more non-quantitative methods, like qualitative methods, like you have group works where you have to talk to people, you have interviews where you actually test your confidence instead of just your book skills. I think those are type of matrices that are also important in life, when you don't just need to be by the book, when there are other aspects and other metrics of life that is important for someone to use in order to be a successful person. And the deputy prime minister tried to tell you like, oh, the person is going to be like, oh, is my essay good enough? The same thing is going to happen on your side when you're going to say, oh, is my answers for the test going to be good enough? I don't see why there's any difference at all. At best, it's going to be a wash, because the stress and mental health individuals, and in your worst case, it's going to happen on both sides of the house. I don't think anyone is going to be able to prevent that. Another thing they tried to talk about, forged results for minorities. And I think the Prime Minister tried to bring out the last 30 seconds of the speech, but it wasn't analyzed properly at all. So let's talk about this, right? They tried to tell you that because like people will be racist or like people will discriminate against minorities when in their interviews or whatever, you have to prove to me why in the current world that we live in, that is still going to happen. I don't think top class universities will openly want to just not accept black individuals, for example, just because they are black. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think if you're someone that has achieved whatever the university required, they will accept you. And that is also because this university will want to maintain their reputation. This university will want to maintain their status as a top class university. You wouldn't just go around only accepting white individuals, and because that's only going to give you a bad rap for your uni as well. So that whole argument doesn't make sense to me. Even if it's true that universities are going to do this, I don't see why it's mutually exclusive, because that can happen under your side of the house as well. When your university sees a name like a name that they don't like or a name that they discriminate against, that means they won't accept that person. So that can also happen under your side of the house. I don't see why is it mutually exclusive. If you want to talk about minorities, I think it actually benefits more on the outside of the house, from Kim's argument earlier. When she told you about how minorities don't have funding to buy books, when minorities don't have funding to actually go for extra classes, we tell you that your other skills that you have can actually help you into getting in these universities. These other skills, like your confidence, for example, you being able to talk to other people, you being able to work together with other people. I think those are the types of things that benefits these minorities because of the circumstances that they live in. They just simply, it's difficult for them to do as well as your privileged white individual, because they just want the birth lottery. So you can't just compare and say that minority is going to have a worse life on the our side, because I think it's going to have a worse life under yours when you only measure them based on exams, and I don't think that is a proper metric to do so. Yeah, and then they also try to talk about how covering all forms of metrics is not good, and I don't know why is it not good. Like, honestly, right, I think Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister tried to tell you that when you have so many different things to focus on, you're going to end up like you have to juggle a few things. Firstly, I think, isn't it more important for someone to get more knowledge on more different areas rather than just focusing on one thing? I'll take a few later. Rather than just focusing on one thing, because I think on the side of opening opposition, we tell you that when you can cover more skills, when you can cover more areas that can actually help you as a person and help you as an individual, we tell you that that's one that is more beneficial for you. Before I move on to my argument, yeah, sure, I'll take a few from OG.
Okay, so I'm not sure where the case was not mutually exclusive. Like the case was just adding more expense, adding new stress, and adding new nepotism. And again, there's still no response to the point that standardized
It's
testing
not about
can
new.
set the
Okay,
motion.
yeah. Okay, the reason why I don't buy this new stress and new nepotism, whatever, because under our side, okay, like under your side, when everything's going to be 100% based on exams, so you're going to be stressed because your whole exam is going to determine your success. Under our side, we tell you that, okay, if I didn't do well in my exams, at least I can do well in my interview. So I think that actually is better for the stress and mental health of the individuals because you actually give them a chance. You actually give them other areas to pursue in order to benefit themselves. Going to be good for individuals. So basically, let's think about this. How are tests done? Basically, you take a bunch of info from textbooks, for example, and then you test it on individuals and you make them answer questions or whatever. Why is this a problem? Is because tests like this, if you make a test like this the sole method to form a successful individual, that's when you're going to create this stigma that, oh, I'm going to have to do well in my exams in order to just get into university. Why this is harmful is because an average person isn't really going to apply their tests in order for their careers in the future, for example. Like I don't need some of my results in my high school in order for me to work in my job in like 10 years time, for example. I think those are the types of reasons that are quite important to note because I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's smart to like just measure people based on tests on something that they're not going to apply in the future. That's why when we have things such as teamwork, when we have interviews, when we assess confidence of individuals, when we assess different types of aspects of the individuals, we tell you that we produce better quality students and we produce a better, a more all-rounded person that can actually be a successful graduate in the future. So three reasons why tests are also something that's flawed. Because number one, some people just can't cope. Some people just can't memorize the whole textbook, while some other people can. So we tell you that, okay, fair lah, if one person can do it, too bad. But we tell you that the best we can do is that provide other methods for this person to succeed. So that doesn't happen under side government because once you fail in your test, then you can't do anything else because that's your only option. You don't have any other alternative. Then we also tell you how there's more important aspects in your life that you need to cover. And also we tell you that we want to remove the stigma that acing your exams is the most important thing in your life. With that, I end my speech. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's begin with the speech. Inviting member of Gov.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. If you have any POIs, please just voice up. I'm not going to be looking at the chat. So starting in 3, 2, 1, go. I'd like to start from observation of this round. I think that in opening exchange, there was a discussion about competition. OG said competition would be more meritocratic and objective. All said this is symmetric. I think this was largely symmetric, although I agree with the opening government that they have proven why competition can be more like slightly better in our side of the house. All said that there would be competition anyway, and also OG was assertive in why the criteria of non-quantitative method, NQ method, is vague in the first place. And that's the reason why I think this competition clash in opening exchange was largely symmetric. I'm going to prove to you from closing government that tangible harm. I'm going to present you with two arguments. Firstly, is that this is going to harm the research in professors. Secondly, this is going to be principally illegitimate. OG just stopped at saying that this dictates students' lives, so it needs to be fair. This was intuitive, but they have never really proven why this is so important to the extent that state has to take actions, right? So firstly, let's get on to our first argument about why this harms the research in professors. So even if we take the best case of opposition that the NQ method is accessible in the first place. So in that case, students will lose the incentive to study basic academic things. For example, like mathematics or the calculus or the maybe engineering, something like that. Why is this likely? Because two reasons. Firstly, is that there's no need for university admission. They don't have to like study really complicated, difficult, those kind of stuff for university admission. Insofar as they have access to NQ methods, right? They can practice nurturing their confidence. They can practice for interviews or something like that. In that case, they don't have incentive to study really difficult math, for example, right? Students would prioritize NQ methods because it seems more accessible, as OO said. And that's the reason why they would opt in to like interviews preparation preparation or maybe interns or maybe part-time jobs that they may be able to use in interviews. Second reason why is that but note here that there's a clear trade-off, right? When you spend time on interns or when you spend time on part-time job, when you spend time on interview preparation, something like that, a lot, like for instance, you work a lot in your intern corporations and you have no energy and time to study at night. You have no energy and time to study for standardized testing on their side of the house. There's a clear trade-off. What this suggests is that they anyway have to go there, even if they realize in the middle that they have to switch to standardized testing because, NQ methods don't really suit them, something like that. They anyway have to pursue NQ methods because they already have disadvantage from other students who have in the first place studied a lot, right? So what this suggests is that they anyway have to pursue NQ methods, and we think this is harmful for three reasons. Because firstly is that they have to, after admission to university, they have to learn from scratch the important knowledge because they have spent their precious time in high school, for instance, to study to prepare for interviews or to do interns or something like that. They have to learn the important academic knowledge from zero in the university. Because, the university wants to nurture researchers, right? And they want students to learn important academic knowledge that is the basis of every single research. But students lack the knowledge of those kind of stuff. Students don't really know about math. They don't really know about statistics. They don't really know about engineering. This means that the university have to provide courses that teach students about those incredibly basic stuff in university. Note here that the high school knowledge isn't really useful in research sphere, right? They have to learn like high-level calculus, for instance, to even start becoming a researcher. They haven't accumulated those knowledge in high schools. And also interns, etc., or the other maybe extracurricular stuff don't really provide students with those important knowledge because they focus on practical skills as opposed to basic academic knowledge that is needed for research. So that's the reason why students would lack the important knowledge. So non-quantitative methods cannot really evaluate the academic ability, obviously, right? They may be able to evaluate the potentials of the students, but potentials don't really matter insofar as students severely lack the knowledge. What is the impact of that? There are two things. Firstly, is that the professors cannot do all of the research. Why? Because they have to provide the basic course to students, like basically every single student, and this takes a lot of time. This means, they have to create a resume for each course. They have to rate the examination result or like that, and they have to listen to students. They have to talk to students about their academic knowledge or something like that. This significantly deprives professors of their time to do research. This means that it significantly delays the new development in the area, for instance, in the medicine area, right? This delays important medical clinical trials in university, for instance, and this is really harmful for the research. But second impact here is that professors get to be way too busy on their side of house. They already have to teach and research at the same time under the status quo, but on their side, they have to do extra. Under the status quo, they have to make a resume for the classes. They have to rate the examination. They have to do research at the same time. They oftentimes work overtime. Because the human resource is limited and university budget is limited, they only have limited number of professors in the first place. What this means is that university cannot hire many professors and they have to exploit the currently existing professors. This means that by accepting students who lack of the knowledge, important knowledge on their side of the house, they need to be exploited even more, right? This gets exacerbated on their side of the house. And this is really important because they are already working overtime and they have to sacrifice their precious weekends to research and also teach students at the same time, and this is going to be exploited. This is debate winning. Because this shows the clear delta in the debate. As I said in my observation in opening exchange, it was unclear why this slightly meritocratic version of the university admission is so beneficial for students, as Oo pointed out. What I've proven from closing government is that it is at least clear that the university professors will be better off on our side of the house, and also research gets better on our side of the house. Second argument then, why is this principally illegitimate? OG said that the university admission dictates your life, so it needs to be fair. This was intuitive, but that was it. Why it has to be so fair to the extent that state has to take actions, right? CJ said there is a reciprocity, right? So state gives tax exemption and subsidy for the university, and state what this means is that state benefits university for arbitrarily choosing students and basically ruining their lives. And this means that the state has to force universities to be accountable, right? Standardized testing is accountable at the very least, as opposed to non-quantitative methods that like largely reflect the bias of the examiners, right? So this reflects, this favors students with the better debating CVs or something like that, as opposed to relatively underprivileged poor students. Standardized testing is the only legitimate and accountable way when it comes to state subsidizing university, and that's what we are proud to propose.
All right, thank that speaker for the speech, inviting member of OP.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yep.
Okay, I'll take one POI from like OG around like the 5th minute. Like always, feel free to unmute. Because I don't look at, you know what, I say I don't look at chat, but then I end up taking POIs in chat. So not doing it very well. So POIs either way is fine. Just I prefer in voice. Like, yeah. Okay, starting my speech. Partner's messaging me something. Oh, he just said he slept with my mom. Okay, that's not helpful. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Government can ban interviews and essays in the universities that take admissions from students, but they can't ban interviews in the marketplace. They can't ban interviews in companies. Look, OG is short-sighted. This is like really obvious. David thinks that 7 minutes of a speech can win a 56-minute debate in the same way that they think that a 4-year degree can make you set for 80 years of life. They don't do any analysis on how getting into university is enough to make your life set. Like, fine, you do really well, you get really good scores, and a bunch of poor people go to university, and then they don't get a job because now they then have debt from that tuition that they have to pay back. Huge amounts of time they spent in that university slaving away trying to do stupid math equations and become like engineers, which by the way, at that point they then will have like significantly worse lives. So their impact itself is not even inherently a good thing. Finding talent is useless if you then make that talent unemployed and depressed. So my argument is going to be very simple. First of all, this set of skills, soft skills, are exceptionally important for the workplace and are really likely to help students get jobs. And that's why we need to train them to get used to things like nepotism, to get used to things like selling yourself. Because if you're an artist who only has a portfolio but has no idea how to sell it to a university, I don't know how you're going to sell it to someone on the street. You're probably going to be another unemployed artist, which, you probably are anyway, an artist, but still. Okay, so first of all, let's start with that. Why is it likely that you really need soft skills to get employed? The first thing I'm going to explain to you is why they matter the most in the marketplace. The first thing is that soft skills are about things like, say, how you express things like essays, how you present yourself to other people. They're often the ones that force you to adapt. They're more likely to force you to be creative and think outside of the box, particularly outside of the academic box. I'm not saying that you won't have problem-solving skills in maths. I'm saying you won't have problem-solving skills when you have to work with someone who doesn't know how to communicate, someone who has some kind of neurodivergent consideration, or someone who doesn't know how to properly talk to people and like just sounds like an idiot like me. At that point, often you become much less efficient at managing people, and it's much less likely that you can adapt to different situations, which means you're often stuck in specific time frames where you're important. No, thank you. Like around the 5th minute. Second of all, it's also important that people skills are sort of like. Wait, what the hell did I write? Okay, yeah. So people skills are also like exponential because they affect every part of your work. Yes, the amount of like how good you are at coding or math is important when you're coding that program, but every other step of your life is going to be based on how you sell that program, how you work with the other colleague, because note that people work in companies with other people. So 80% of your time is going to be working through a different process that you aren't skilled or trained in. You work on your hard skills and then you work with other people to do it. The majority of your work is how you communicate with other people, and so that matters more. And note, I'm going to tell you why interviews test the skill properly in a second. The third thing then is that teamwork can fuck over every other worker because it changes the mental health of people in the first place. If someone is very bad at communicating their considerations, every other worker, 80% of the workforce, can often be slower and be harmed by the fact that this person can't effectively talk to them, or the fact that this person is not selling properly can mean the entire company doesn't get a deal because they don't know how to do that in the first place. But finally, and this is the most important thing, automation as well as AI means that often a lot of things that are repetitive and formulaic, which by the way, OG has to concede to, otherwise they can't be objective, are things that AI is going to considerably get better at. So what happens is that what's more important is the capacity for you as a human to consistently learn like different skills that are human, uniquely outside of the idea of automation. So all of this makes these skills particularly important in the marketplace. Why will we test for these skills properly, and why will people learn them? So we test for them properly because, first of all, companies often fund these research in the first place. They're looking specifically for what kind of skills they want in employees. So you can use this research to make these tests and interviews. And the universities often want this because one of the biggest metrics they use has to be things like income. Because note that for most people, university is a stepping stone to getting money and a job, because most people don't have like a thirst for knowledge. This is objectively empirically true because most people don't become academics. They become like workers and need to earn money. But second of all, it's also true that nepotism and all of the
POI.
fudging is something that still exists in the job market, right? You still have to like suck up to a boss, or at the very least, you need to convince a company that you, with a somewhat similar work experience and good grades, are better than the other person with also similar work experience and good grades. So you need to sell yourself. The problem is when you don't learn that in university, you still have to learn it eventually when you come out of university. You still have to learn it when you go into the job market. The problem is that when you don't learn it in the system of university, that's when the huge amount of effort and money comes in, because the professors aren't helping you with it. There is no admissions, it's like entire industry that's helping you work on it. But third of all, you also force more research into this matter, and you understand how to learn these skills and make them more accessible for people when the universities focus on this. Okay. Finally, why exactly then do people learn these skills when this is something that is important? And this is where I'm going to like also clash a lot of what PM says. Yeah, quickly, Ujib.
So it seems to me that instead of cramming a lifetime's worth of soft skills into 1 year's admission cycle, you can learn soft skills in 4 years of university through public speaking classes without worsening the most stressful period of your life.
Okay, but why would you teach someone public speaking classes when you've tested them based on academics and now you need to squeeze out all of that academic skill? But this is squeezing a lifetime worth of soft skills. You're setting someone on the pathway to actually discovering these soft skills. And this is actually quite important because this is what I'm going to talk about now. So OG says that this is about like a lot of money focused on data that improves standardized testing. Well, that also means that to a large extent, you have to have more long tests. Because look, if there's 1,600 points in the SAT, I'm sorry, there's a lot more than 1,600 people. They're going to have the same score often. So you have to increase the amount of tests. This is why the gaokao is 9 hours. This is why the JEE is 3-hour exams in India. And people have to sit for days on end to take more and more exams with more and more information that they then have to cram. That is a lifetime of information they have to go for. On our side, you have more access because maybe you're really good at academics. You have that option on our side. But if you're not, you also have the option of social skills on our side, which gives you the opportunity to get into university at all. So first, resource allocation goes to test takers. So that means people on who actually don't have that many soft skills get the money and research funding that don't go to people without social skills, which means that even if they're like forced to learn social skills eventually, often the bosses don't know how to work properly. The people who have like good degrees don't know how to work properly. But second of all, it's about the fact that you have a lack of access to this personality because you defocus like so focus skill, right? Like you don't learn to sell yourself, so you don't actually access this thing. Because the university doesn't have like a system designed to test it properly. You don't have all those metrics of the university, by the way, publishes to make sure that you know how you're getting in. But third of all, it's an external sense of worth, right? It's not internal. It devastates people's self-esteem because it's about you objectively have to do well in this test. And if you don't, you are just wrong, as opposed to you have to present the best version of yourself, which means people often lose the capacity to keep working. On accessibility, then, this is a lot of rebuttal to OG. So what they say is that this is about like accuracy and like how this is qualitative stuff is really hard, because they say there's a lot of content to learn. It's very hard to check because it takes like more time. And then like the resumes that you get are like really inaccessible to people. So first off, lots of content. Like it's not a lot of content actually. It's one piece of content, which is explaining to someone why on a human level you matter. But second, on how it's really hard to check. I'm sorry, but it's not that hard to check because it's specifically something that you're going to have to check in the real world, things that people standardize in the job market. But third, they say resumes and inaccessibility. No, it's about your personal stories. People understand not everyone has huge amounts of money. And if they didn't, then the tutoring that they would expect on OG would be symmetric and the amount of people accessing university would also be bad. Since OG is so short-sighted, I'm very happy to prove to you that people win this debate because we're closing opposition and we're actually further on in the debate, and then my op will win it.
All right, let's begin with the speech. Invite Kavip.
Hello, I am audible.
Yes.
I prefer POIs in the chat, and I don't have any preferred gender pronouns. My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Closing government takes this debate because we're the only team who talked about what universities are for and why the ban is legitimate, right? This was extremely important within the debate because this is a policy debate, and when the government bans something onto people and they affect a lot of people, we need a legitimacy for doing so, right? Given this, I'm going to talk about like why we won against like 3 individual teams in the order of 1, closing opposition, and secondly, opening opposition, and thirdly, opening government. So firstly, starting with closing opposition. So like their basic point was that soft skills are important in the workplace and it is important in the future, and therefore universities should adopt non-quantitative tests, right? My initial response to that is like, so what? Because universities are specifically not designed to be a vocational school, right? If you want to like directly go into workplace and be good at like things like interviews or like writing stuff, then like you can go into vocational schools and like directly like work in offices, right? Universities, as my partner speaker too already told you, that the university is a place for research, and government funds university for that reason, right? The reason why that like the government is entitled to spend money onto like universities and like to like tax exempt them to start with is because of the fact that the universities are doing research to the society that benefit. Argue that universities are important for vocational training, and universities are important to like prepare like the students for the future, and then like they need to reanalyze what universities are for and why like the government is funding the universities to start with, right? I don't think the closing opposition did that, and therefore we don't think closing opposition's argument was like important at all, right? But furthermore, I think like the things like preparing like those students for the future and stuff like that cannot be done with non-quantitative tests, right? Firstly, because like when you go into universities and try to write essays and try to be good at interviews, you go into like cram schools and stuff like that, and you prepare for that so much, right? In the process of doing so, we think like you're not like speaking your truth, and you're not like trying to be like actually passionate. In that instance, we don't think like it is like workable to like actually better your soft skills, right? Second of all, we think like this type of like improving the soft skills in general can be done after you get into universities when you're job searching, for example, right? Like you anyway have to do things like preparing for interviews, writing a lot of essays to go into companies. At that instance, we don't think that is something that is important. So that is like my response to closing opposition. Now moving on to opening opposition. So like the basic point coming from opening opposition is that the non-quantitative tests are good because like they can know the students' traits other than intellectual capacities, right? And they also talked about how the students are going to face less stress, which is good, right? We think like the point of like less stress was a huge wash on like the opening half, and therefore we think like we need to focus on like what the university is looking for and why that is like extremely important, right? All these responses to opening position was to say that standardized tests measure diverse abilities as well, right? I agree with this, but like this does not bite the bullet of like opening position saying that being able to pick kids who are fit for that specific universities is good, right? Closing government wins this debate because we solve this conflict within the opening half. Because speaker 2 talks about how standardized tests are the only ways to measure necessary abilities for further studies or research that students are going to do in universities, right? Opening position talked about like they can do both and stuff like that, but we say that the fact that we have unrelated portion in the process of like picking kids is good, is bad, right? For example, like when you have kids in university that have not studied for example mathematics in like this class of like mathematics or like statistics, you have to like spend a lot of time to talk about the basic knowledge before you get into like advanced knowledges, right? And therefore we think like having those people who are not qualified to study to start with is something that is extremely harmful, right? Opposition might talk about how like they can measure things like passion, or they can measure things about like emotional capacity for that specific study, but like we don't think it is something that is measurable from things like interviews or essays, right? Because like you can like lie in interviews, you can lie on essays about like how passionate you are about certain things, right? On the other hand, the fact that you have spent so much time and the fact that you have skills to do, for example, mathematics, for example, I don't know, like writing, having like a lot of vocabularies in like certain fields is something that proves the fact that you are passionate about something, proves the fact that you're going to study further once you get into the universities, right? And therefore, at A, we think like the impact coming from operating inflation was quite vague. We think closing government proved on the more clearer impact of like delay on research, a delay on the studies, etc., right? And therefore, we think closing government takes over operating opposition. Lastly, I'm moving on to operating government. Operating government was very clear on what both worlds look like and the benefits of standardized tests, right? However, we think like their failure was, on the other hand, why this like ban is just, why we need to do this on policy, right? This is where closing government takes over opening government, because we talked about how universities are at the end of the day are place for researchers, right? Students either try to become researchers in the future, or students are the assistants for the research that are done in universities by professors, right? And like when you do that, it is like it makes it extremely difficult for professors to conduct their researches, like when the students are not qualified to do so, right? For example, professors cannot ask students to like do like basic calculations or do like the basic research bit and stuff like that, right? This is like extremely important in the debate, because like we were the first teams to show you why we need to ban this to start with, right? We also talked about how why we are able to control universities. The reason being the government is like funding universities, government is the tax exempting universities, and like how because of the fact that we are receiving tax from the people and like we are funding the universities, we need to make sure that the universities are being beneficial to everyone in the country, right? And therefore, at the end of the day, closing government made more contribution to the debate by talking about more solid impact on like why this is being harmful to the universities and why we need to do this now. And therefore, at the end of the day, we take over all of the three teams. We're very happy to propose. Thank you.
All right, and let's begin with the speech. I invite Opwhip.
Okay, cool. Am I audible? Just check.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Let's begin. Okay. For POIs, if you could offer them in the chat, that'd be great. I will be able to see them. The first thing I want to point out is a bit of framing that is relevant to how you value university in this debate. I want to note that admissions determined decades of your school life. Given that when you are applying for university and in university counts for the majority of your formative years, the way that you get into university and the things that you believe are valuable when you are getting university determine how you perceive your own competence for your entire life. You spend hours and hours working on the things that you use to get into university, so it's really important to make the distinguishment between whether or not it's on academics or whether or not it's on soft skills and a balance of those things with academics. And the university never really cares about soft skills inherently because it's a university. Therefore, they will inherently focus on academics if there aren't a countervailing narrative to try to focus on other things. This is the narrative that you hear since you're a kid, and as a result, you're going to be valuing things like studying for exams, which is really important on what kind of skills you're going to learn and what kind of skills you're going to be competent at when you move into the workforce. Then I want to move into a few important things in my speech. One, I want to thoroughly rebut opening government. Second, I want to weigh against opening government. Then I'm going to explain why we weigh over the other teams. One, I want to talk about the accessibility argument that opening government advances. OG says our system is worse for poor people. This is rebuttal to explain why our system is actually better for these people. The reason why is because the people who are subjectively evaluating your essays and your interviews are people that are on boards for universities. Who are these boards of people? They're obsessed with meritocracy because they themselves believe that they got their position through skill and the hard work of themselves. Therefore, they want and value the hard work of other people. Two, they respect difficulty because they're generally liberal people that are indoctrinated by liberal education in most places. And they're often, and these kinds of rich people love helping the poor people because it makes themselves feel internally good. Thirdly, they want people who they can work with well because they will be in their school. They'll be the ones that they're admitting for their own research purposes. So they want these people to be competent. They want these people to be competent on our side of the house. Two, once they have this information, they can literally prepare for supporting poor students or students with difficulties to get them into university because scholarships collect all that information. And once kids are at university, you tell them to just get the fuck out and get grades on government because that's the thing that you continue to value when they're from the ages of 14 to 18. You're likely to continue to value that when they're older as well. B, messaging on whether you should even apply for university if you don't have hard skills changes significantly. You tell charismatic people to apply themselves and try really, really hard to develop those skills, which is different on our side of the house. And thirdly, giving access to any university education at all the poor people is an impact of our case rather than the case of opening government. Next, I want to talk about the additional thing that they show. The main thing that the first argument that they give to you is that preparation is going to be much worse. The first reason that it's more difficult, they have a couple mechanisms for this. The first kind of mechanism they give is that there's going to be more styles of testing, therefore preparation will be worse. This is not true, because on our side of the house, you need to go deeper. You need to have more difficult tests and more difficult questions that test more levels of mathematics, more levels of English, more amount of history. And the reason why this is particularly harmful and why it's actually worse for their side is the reason that opening opposition does not give you is because of competition. As the extension clearly points out, there are a limited number of spots, so you're going to get a race to the bottom in maximizing your ability to do well in these tests and maximizing your ability to emphasize these skills. This also refutes the second, so the result is you're going to spend more time on interviews. Yes, you will spend more time on interviews, but you will move it away from studying more complicated mathematics or more complicated concepts of history, which can actually be comparatively more frustrating on their side of the house. This also refutes the second mechanism about facts in different ways, because more different ways doesn't necessarily equal it's going to be more difficult, because you're expected to have that knowledge at a lower level. So you don't have to have multiple levels of university of calculus that you're likely to know, whereas the comparative is on our side, you have a lower level of expectation. This mitigates the likelihood of these two mechanisms. Now I want to flip them. It is easier to learn a wider variety of skills. Why? These skills are specifically picked up because they're useful to your everyday life as a real human being, and you're likely to do things that people find more enjoyable, so they can invest more of their time into learning these skills that are useful. So interviewing is tangential to your thinking skills and your feet and your presentation skills, which can be done in extracurricular activities like Gamal UN or debate that are interesting and fun for a lot of people to do. The suggestion that students in China are less burned out than places with quantitative university selections is ridiculous. It's ridiculous because people don't get to live their lives on their side of the house. You get a race to the bottom because there's going to be tens of millions of people who are all competing to get the highest number on a specific test, which means you dedicate tons and tons of your time towards being able to succeed at these things. Secondly, you also get a race to the bottom in ways that are significantly more pernicious. On our side of the house, when universities value the sport, you can get exercise, you can increase your creativity, you can debate to explore your intellectual creativity, you can spend your time in high school doing things that are comparatively more meaningful, you get to socialize with other people rather than having to spend tons of your time with a specific tutor or go to cram school and study for long hours in a day, which is comparatively much less meaningful. And as a result, it's better on our side of the house. Second criticism is that it's vague. They say it's hard to track improvement. I'm going to challenge the plausibility of this. We can see it's probably not as precise as a number, but it's reasonably easy to get feedback on how good your interview or essays are, because you can ask your teacher, you can see what their critiques are, you can see maybe you need to fix your clarity, your argumentative skills, your evidence. And this is actually very much like debate, where there are observable ways to quantify these things, like on the speaker scale. So if you go to cram school every day and get the highest test score, that is something that you're comparatively trading off. If you can go to a cram school every day to try to get the highest test score, you can ask your teacher for feedback on your essay, and it's reasonably easy to see the levels of improvement that you're likely to get. I'll take it from opening government.
Hold up. If these skills are easy to pick up, this sort of invalidates your whole first argument that you desperately need these skills. The clearest thing here is that you have the testing race on both sides, but you add to it far more by doubling it on op.
No, they're not easier to pick up. It still takes a lot of time to work at them, but it comparatively doesn't crush your soul nearly as much compared to having to study multiple levels of years of like calculus or history. It doesn't kill your soul to have to do this repetitive thing every day that you probably have lots of difficulty understanding because you're 16 years old and you don't understand third year calculus as closing government exactly says they will do. On the grave harm, I think I'm going to skip this. I think on their side of the house, if you fail a test, you only have one metric to see yourself like successful. On our side, you have many different metrics. I think this was already reasonably rebutted by opening opposition. Next, I want to weigh against opening government and what our case pretty much proves. One, I want to point out that education is useful not because it gets you into university, but because it makes your life better. And our path to victory is very clear. We explain why soft skills are crucially important to be successful in the workforce. There are two pushbacks they give. One, you'll learn them in university. One, this is symmetric. You can learn academics too. But when universities check based on soft skills, they explicitly signal that it's more important. And you continue to believe that it's more important when the universities are testing you for this on admission when you are in university and continuing to learn more skills that are useful in your life. On government, universities heavily focus on academics because that's what schools are directly filtering for. We get a countervailing narrative of opposition, and they don't get solvency on government. Secondly, I want to quickly bench weigh us against closing government as well. On the bench, I think that opening opposition is reasonable, but our arguments are more important because they give like mitigation and accessibility arguments. We clearly explain to you why people will actually reasonably get in on our side of the house to universities that, and when they get into university, they have better skills to be able to succeed. On closing government, I think that the arguments kind of defeat themselves. I think one, it's is probably a problem that like it's implausible that you won't have like necessary research skills, because you still can actually learn other kinds of things in extracurricular activities or non-quantitative things on outside the house, like do a research program during the summer or summer camps, like things like this. We don't think this meaningfully changes on outside the house, as we're also unclear about the impact, so it's unclear why they weigh over us. We're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, thank that speaker for the speech. Thank all debaters for an excellent round. I would invite the panelists to join me in Discord room A11. Debaters can stay back here. We'll get back in like 10 to 15 minutes. Panelist, we are waiting for you in A11.
I can't seem to join the Discord room. There's no option for me to join it.
You can click on the voice channel, like the second thing, which has the speaker, like on the left.
Yeah, I'm doing that, and there is just blank. After seeing the two people on the call, I can't see. Wait, let me leave Zoom first.
All right. Just to quickly check if we have everyone opening government.
Here.
All right. Opening up,
Yeah.
closing government,
Yeah.
closing up.
Yep.
All right. So this feedback is gonna go. Verdict, rationale, lastly, questions if any. Okay, verdict. We had a long deliberation. We have a unanimous decision. We give a first to opening government, second to closing opposition, a third to opening opposition, and a fourth, unfortunately, to closing government. Rankings in the chat. I'll just repeat that once again for clarity. First to OG, second to CO, third to O, fourth to CG. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move chronologically throughout this debate, starting with OG, finishing with CO, comparing teams as they come about in the round. All right, what do we get from opening government? I think the larger push that I get from opening government is this idea that firstly, I think there's some framing in terms of why standardized testing is something that is improving largely in general, in terms of like testing more amount of like being more meritocratic and essentially testing your skills more, incorporating more amount of recent research and relevant topics, and the very fact that you can have multiple attempts, etc. So even if you fail in the first attempt, you can take subsequent attempts. And I think they also say that it's likely to be more inclusive over time in terms of, say, for example, having audio aids for people who otherwise would have difficulty in like sitting in a place for a long time. I think DPM also says in terms of art or other courses, you can also have different things in terms of different mechanisms through which you can incorporate or test the skill of the individual in the first place to begin with. Okay, so I think, so this is largely why they prove in terms of why this is likely to be done in a good way. I think the second part of the argument is largely to go ahead and establish in terms of why, what are the harms that exist, point at which you have other like qualitative aspects also incorporated in terms of SS, etc. So I think the first thing they go ahead in terms of saying, in terms of these things are largely likely to be arbitrary in the first place to begin with, which means it's difficult to assess things like, say, for example, essays, things like resumes, which are largely likely to be things in subjective. I think the things which are likely to be subjective. The principle that they push is, if these are things that are likely to determine the outcome of your life, like largely, so these are things that should be more towards in terms of an objective evaluation than an arbitrary metric that is largely likely to be pushed forward. I think the argument that then crystallizes from OG is this idea that one, it puts more amount of pressure on individuals to go ahead and hone skills in these other domains as well. In terms of you have to now work on your essays, you have to work on your interviews, you have to work basically like N+1 in terms of what you're already doing for the standardized test. The impact of this, I think they're able to prove in terms of this putting more amount of mental stress and pressure on individuals at a very early age that like perhaps pushes them into the worst extremities. But even if not, it essentially puts a huge amount of burden in terms of the kind of things that you then have to balance, etc. at that particular instance. I think that they're able to say when you have one umbrella under which you essentially are testing skills in terms of the standardized tests existing, it's easy for you to essentially evaluate yourself, get more concise feedback, but you don't have to like delve into multiple domains to essentially put pressure on you as an individual at those instances. So I think this is largely what I get from OG in terms of the impacts. How does opening opposition respond to this? I think the first thing that O says is in terms of why, why you should have multiple metrics to go ahead and evaluate the skills of individuals. I think the first thing that they say is it's difficult for people from multiple backgrounds to essentially succeed in one standardized test. And at that point, they should have the alternate avenues to choose, like in terms of other skills that they can portray. The problem with this argument is I'm not too clear because the way OG sets this up is to say that if resources are limited for individuals who perhaps like are vulnerable and who have, say, for example, limited amount of resources to work with, if it's difficult for you to essentially succeed in one aspect, then how can you essentially do that in N+1 aspects in those particular regards? So either this argument from opening opposition assumes that you're like by default a pro in these skills in the first place, or you're born with these talents, which I'm like not willing to buy in the vast majority of instances. So which is you probably have to work on these skills as well in terms of your interview skills, or say, for example, your confidence or the way you speak and those things that O talks about. So it's not that those things are intrinsically present. I think OG makes it particularly clear that you have to work on those aspects as well to develop those aspects and become competitive in those aspects as well. So in that regard, I think it's more clearer that this puts the additional amount of pressure. So if you're not able to succeed in terms of, say, lack of resources with the standardized test, then I'm not sure how you're likely to succeed in those other N+1 domains as well that are largely likely to put on you. I think the first like clash is pretty clear in terms of this putting more amount of mental health burden on individuals, in terms of this making it more difficult for you to actually be successful in those avenues. Rather, if you reduce the burden on students, particularly if they have limited amount of resources, then they're better able to essentially be successful, like only through standardized tests, than essentially like diverting into multiple domains than in the first place. I think the second thing that I largely get from opening opposition is this idea that, okay, I think the mitigation in terms of why, okay, I think the idea that largely exists is in terms of colleges should have the ability to pick and choose in terms of the kind of students that they want, that would fit into the kind of working of the college in the first place. I think this argument is not very well particularly developed, and why colleges should have this degree of autonomy in the first place, I think is largely challenged by DPM when they say that college culture, if it exists, is largely bad, because this means that you hold on to these nepotistic practices. Like basically privileged institutions can still continue to gatekeep and like admit selective individuals that they want to, like in that particular regard, making it uneven playing field for vast majority of individuals. So why that autonomy should be conferred to colleges in the first place is something that I'm not clear about, and why like things like college culture, etc., need to be preserved is something that I don't get a substantiation from DLO. I think the mitigation that I get from DLO is to say that top class universities won't accept you anyway, because if they have to discriminate, they would do so either way. The problem is, I think it misses the point at which when you have multiple avenues and essentially subjective metrics to discriminate on, as OG points out, I think your ability to discriminate at that instance essentially increases than, say, for example, with one standardized test, with a standardized score that now universities have to take into consideration. So the avenues or the propensity to essentially discriminate essentially reduces on opening government. So I think that's the weighing that had to be responded to on opening opposition, rather by saying like perhaps they would discriminate either way by just like through arbitrary like or ascriptive characteristics, which I don't think is a sufficient response to the kind of setup that OG makes in the first place to begin with. I think then is in terms of okay, I think towards the like last like end of this speech, I do get some idea in terms of why the average individual won't essentially apply the skills in terms of like the skills that you learn from SAT, etc., or the kind of so-called academic standardized test skills, and rather things like teamwork and confidence is something that is important. The problem with this is you never explain why things like teamwork, confidence are more important than, say, for example, the skills or the kind of academic knowledge you would get through SATs. So even if like you assert that these are important, you never prove why this is more important, like in the first place to begin with, that universities need to necessarily incorporate this in the test taking procedure, which I think CEO extends, which I'll get to later. But even if this is the case, I don't see why these are comparative the university in the first place to begin with. In conclusion, in the top half, I think what OG is able to prove is, one, why these tests would be more holistic, which also I would note that opening opposition does not really respond to the framing. So a lot of things in terms of like why these tests are more rigorous, put more pressure on kids, and perhaps why this is not holistic is already, I think, countered and preempted by the PM framing in terms of why they are progressively getting better. So why they are still likely to be so coercive is something that is not proven on opening opposition, and that frame had to be challenged. So I think then why these tests are likely to be more progressive and holistic is something that OG is able to prove, but I think largely is in terms of why this reduces the amount of mental stress on students when you do not have to diverge into so many avenues to essentially get into the university system, and things that are more objective, ensures a more fairer way to get into the university, are things that OG is better able to prove. That's why in terms of access and accountability, it's opening government over opening opposition on the opening exchange. Bring in closing government to the debate. I think the extension that I get from CG is this idea. I think the premise of this is point at which when you want to develop other skills, you have to like do say, for example, part-time jobs, which means at that point of time, you perhaps won't have the time to develop those critical academic skills that are required for SATs. Then you go on to this idea that perhaps universities have to go ahead and teach this in the first place. That would take away time from, say, professors engaging in research. And at that point of time, you'd have less amount of like research into things like clinical trials and stuff like that. The first problem that I have with this extension is, one, I don't see the entire correlation of this argument. That is to say, like why is your soft skills likely to take up so much amount of time that you neglect your academic skills completely? But secondly, why can't universities have a holistic curriculum in which they teach basic things, but as well as like soft skills at the same time? But thirdly, even if this is not true, like, why is research so important in this round? You never explain in terms of why. I think the extent of this argument is universities are bastions for research, and research is largely affected and, like, say, neglected, point at which now they have to engage in teaching these basic skills, but you never prove what the value of research is. Why is this so important for the individual, or why this is so important for largely society in general? So what the value of research at the end of the day is not very clear. Hence your impact in terms of why research gets affected, which is the crux of your extension. The premise of this is not clearly proven, or like what is the tangible benefit accruing out of it. So, and then I think there are like a bunch of mitigatory responses in terms of how you can still learn the soft skills in university, etc., and all of that, which I think is the POI that OG anyway asks. So I think the problem here is also the premise of this extension is not clear in terms of why research is so important. I'm more likely to buy in terms of what opening government says, that why things that are more objective in terms of people getting into the university is something that should be prioritized more in terms of SAT scores, etc., and why mental health, etc., and these things of individuals would matter more in this round in terms of this literally having a direct impact on the students at the entry point of admission. So I think these are more clearer impacts in this round and more tangible and proximate, whereas I'm not very clear in terms of why research is so important in these universities and what the value at the end of the day is this to like students largely in general, but the harm that is caused to students in terms of the amount of mental health stress that is done, and why an objective metric is a more fairer way to assess students and allows them easier access to universities, are more clearer and proximate impacts in this debate. But also, just to like, technically you don't weigh over your opening government as well in terms of telling us why research is more important than what OG already has established. So in the lack of an explicit weighing as well, you take it below your opening on the bench. Comparing this to opening opposition, I think one, I do not have unique responses to OO's case. Like things like your debating CV, etc., is largely likely to be prioritized, which requires more amount of resources and skills, etc. It puts more amount of stress because you have to do other things as well. Is basically like even the crux of your argument in terms of it takes away, like, because other things take away time from your basic academic skills, which essentially means it becomes more and more difficult for you to manage, is basically the same thing that OG says in terms of this putting more amount of stress on you, and it's difficult for you to balance things at the end of the day. So I do not have and like unique lines of responses that I get like from your side to the opening op case. Like even if, say, for example, things like soft skills that can be learned in unis is literally the reassertion of the POI that was asked by OG in the first place. So without like an extension that is clearly proven in terms of premise, but also like not unique lines of responses that I get from OO, like in those instances, I have to place you below opening opposition as well. Bring in closing opposition to the round. The first thing that I get from CO is the explanation why these soft skills are actually important, extending over opening opposition. I think they're able to explain why these soft skills and essays are creative and make you think out of the academic box, which means these are things that are more like applicable in the real life in terms of collaborating and communicating with other people. Perhaps they're also able to explain perhaps the basic skills that you learn would be only incorporated for the coding aspect, but everything that surrounds that is something that is largely based on interpersonal skills and qualitative skills largely in general. But also, I think they're able to then prove is in terms of why yeah, so these are things that are like largely important to like essentially sell yourself and get a job. But also I think there is a more clearer premise in terms of why universities are avenues for individuals to get employed, and it's like proving this argument a bit more in terms of why like more people who opt into universities want jobs at the end of the day in terms of scale, and like more amount of workers are essentially churned out than essentially people who enter into academics. So universities are largely places where you want to like what do you call, like want to get a job at the end of the day. That's why these soft skills, etc., become important. The way this compares with CG very quickly is, I think, one, it already challenges the premise that CG sets about in terms of research being more important is not something that they're able to justify. CO is more able to justify in terms of why like things like employability are things that are more important, and why soft skills fit into that bracket, and that's why you should go ahead and prioritize that in the first place. Also, I do not have like explicit responses from CG on the CO material in terms of why perhaps these skills are not so important, or perhaps you can alternatively have them on your side of the house, apart from like reasserting that POI that OG asks. So which means in those instances, I think CO is better able to prove the premise in the closing exchange in terms of why employability are things that we should care about than comparatively more. The problem I have with this extension, comparing this to opening government, is one, I think the POI in terms of asking that why these skills can't be learned in the university itself. To which I think the response is to say that like you would largely want to incorporate this right from the get-go, which I think then is substantiated on WIP in terms of saying that when universities signal this in the admission process, they already think that this is important in terms of setting out, in terms of what they want subsequently. This, I think, is a little bit unsubstantiated to prove in terms of why these soft skills have to be assessed at the entry point of admission, rather than, say, for example, these skills could be learned over time within the university process. Or the alternative, in terms of why, if at the entry point I do not consider these skills, there's less amount of emphasis structurally on this during the university course, during the degree process in the first place to begin with. Because I do not have like clear mechanisms in terms of why that would not happen, or why universities would suddenly drop soft skills during their academic tenure, I'm more inclined to buy that this is something that perhaps perhaps if done at a lesser degree, but still would be done to some extent in the universities as well, which reduces the amount of delta you have on that argument. But secondly, I think in terms of like comparing to opening government on the mental health clash, in terms of like this becoming more burdensome for individuals and all of that, I think in terms of like this comparatively becoming more burdensome, the analysis that I get is largely to say that perhaps maths becomes comparatively more difficult, and perhaps you have to have more levels in English now in the first place to begin with, rather than, say, for example, other avenues that you can go into, say, for example, your communication skills or interview skills. The problem is I don't have the clearer delta in terms of to what extent does math get more difficult, or to what extent does, say, for example, English get more difficult on your side of the house, to compare this with the stress that I get from OG. Because I think OG does more amount of legwork in proving in terms of, as I mentioned, I mean, you probably have to work on these essays and work on these interviews as well, not something that you're like good at by default, which means in those circumstances, I think OG is better able to prove how this incrementally affects your mental health more and adds that N+1 incremental pressure on you and puts that burden on you as an individual in the first place. So I think that delta is comparatively proven more in this round, how incrementally this affects your mental health when you have to diverge into multiple avenues, then that particular avenue essentially concretizing and becoming more difficult inherently. So even though I do have assertions in terms of JEE Advanced being more difficult and other like tests that you take being more difficult, to what extent does that happen, and how does that pressure compare with the mental health stress that is put up by going into diverse avenues? That is the weighing that I think had to be done on closing opposition to take it over OG in terms of that exchange on the long diagonal. In the absence of this, I think OG does comparatively a more sufficient job in proving why these are things that essentially put more amount of stress on the individual, and that's why it makes life more difficult for you. Lastly, then, just on the off bench, I think CO is, even though it's close, and I feel that CO essentially needs to do a little bit more explicit weighing in terms of the vertical, but I think CO is still able to prove comparatively more why these skills are more important in real life, and perhaps there should be an emphasis on these skills in the first place. I think the O argument stops to the extent where these are important and more like relevant than the, say, for example, the skills that you learn in the standardized test, but you don't really explain why that is the case in the first place, which CO is able to prove, but also in terms of impacts that you're better able to get a job, better able to essentially fit into the larger world outside in general, which I think are more clearer impacts of the argument, which I don't think opening opposition has in that regard. For all those reasons, OG, CO, OO, CG. Yeah. Any questions?
Can I ask for so one question I want to ask, like, do you think it's more strategic to address OG on their metric on like mental health and accuracy of applications in this debate? Or do you think it was better to outframe them? Like we tried to and didn't. So like, which one do you think was more strategic? And if you think it was outframing, which we tried, like, how would you do it?
So I think the second part of it, if we can discuss in constructive, but I think the first part of it in terms of like engaging with this directly, I think you come the closest in terms of saying how the levels would become now more difficult, which I think is firstly like a little bit thrown around as an example in the first speech. In the WIP speech, I think I get some level of substantiation in terms of perhaps English will have more levels, maths will have more levels, and this gets incrementally more difficult within itself. So I think how that affects the individual more, and how that essentially ensures that it becomes perhaps more difficult for you to access those subjects in the first place, I think would deal better with the accessibility metric that OG pushes forward, than essentially like dealing with the soft skills issue, which I think can be, yeah. So that I think would have been the more clearer clash in this round.
Okay, so you think like it would have been more strategic to go for that same metric, right?
Yeah, the same metric, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I just I just have a difficulty doing it, but yeah.
Thanks for the call, everyone. Do we just like
all
message
right,
you for feedback?
Yeah. If you guys have any questions, just hit me up on Messenger. Otherwise, I mean, text me on Discord. I'll get back in a while. All right. Thanks a lot for the round, guys. All the best for next round.
Thanks for the OA. Thanks for the round.